it feels a bit like in the Eurogroup. There's so many finance ministers around. The difference to the Eurogroup is they're all Greek. So on Europe, well, I could now say everything has already been said, so this is it. But Europe is indeed a very, very puzzling place, and also, as we see from the reactions in the UK, it's a very puzzling question, because you see people who voted for Brexit because they wanted to have more autonomy and more sovereignty. Sovereignty from the meddling of the Court of Justice, and more sovereignty for trade policy, so that they could have, as you were saying, a more liberal trade policy. But of course, when the UK joined back in the 70s, they knew exactly what they were getting into, namely European Court of Justice and a common trade policy. And there is a certain dichotomy in the UK that you've got one group which wants to regain total autonomy also on trade policy, to have a very liberal trade policy. The most liberal, I think, the Donald would tweak something along the most liberal you can ever imagine. Whereas there is another group that wants to protect their jobs by being protectionist. And so you have the same result from very different kinds of motivation. And my origins genetically are in extremely many European countries. And my English grandfather, in the 70s, I asked him, why do you have this obsessive debate about Europe or not Europe, and Europe or not Europe? And he thought for a couple of minutes, and then he said, well, don't really know. I think it's all these foreigners. So I think in reality, probably immigration played a much larger role than the meddling of the Court of Justice. And maybe to pick up on some of the things that have been said previously. We are in an era of very low growth, and we recently had a voting procedure amongst colleagues. Are we in an era of low growth and volatility, and will we return back to normal in a fairly short time? Or is this a regime shift? Are we going to see for the foreseeable future something totally new? And there were 9 of us, and 7 said, we'll be back to normal fairly soon, and 2 of us said, this is a complete regime shift. And indeed, there is research that shows that coming out of a financial crisis, it takes you much, much longer to adjust to a capital account crisis than to a current account crisis. So there is a certain reason possibly for being optimistic that we will return back to normal shortly. But indeed, growth, I think low growth is with us for the medium term at least. It has had a very differentiated impact on different member states. And 5 years back, I thought it was, I tended to think that very many of these problems, for which Italy was for me always the prime example and candidate and best showcase, that 80% of the problems stemmed from globalization and how individual countries reacted to globalization. You could react well and pragmatically in a pro-growth and pro-productivity manner, and you could hide the problem under the carpet and thereby prolong the issues. But increasingly, and also in line with recent research, I've more and more come to believe that it's 80% technology and only 20% globalization, and that we are indeed in a sea shift of our economies where technology is displacing people at very, very rapid rates. And there the composition of GDP matters. If you have a composition of GDP as you might have in Switzerland or in Germany or in Sweden, then the net effects are beneficial. And if you have a composition of GDP, as for example in Portugal, the net effects are simply detrimental. And then the question is what to do. And you, of course, you have the same effects within the United States. If you look at measures of inequality that are not interpersonal inequality measured by the Gini coefficient, but if you look at inequality between individual states in the US, the inequalities there, the differences in per capita GDP are much more pronounced than in Europe, much more pronounced. But to the United States economic and social model, it matters less. Inter alia, because it's a more perfect monetary union, and you get onto the next Greyhound in Mississippi, and up you go to wherever you go, and leave behind everybody else in Mississippi. So this means that we are faced with a common technology shock and globalization shock, and the world in Europe and in the United States was always pro-free trade and pro-globalization, as long as the Europeans and the Americans had the impression that they were the main beneficiaries. Free trade brought benefits to elderly white men. And all of a sudden, this comfortable world is over. And the benefits of globalization are accruing to people in Latin America and in Asia, predominantly. And this means that the whole position, especially of Europe in the globe, has changed, and it'll never be the same again. And there are people who argue that it was only this funny period of 300, 400 years where China was not the technologically leading and the dominant nation globally, and that we're now returning back to a more historical normal. I think that's maybe or may not be, but we have to come to grips with a world where inequality between continents has radically decreased. The world has become a much more equal place. But the structural shifts that are associated with that within Europe are making life extremely difficult. And in that, we had a fairly homogeneous European Union until we had Eastern enlargement. And we grew from 10 to 12 to 15, and now to 28, and then back to 27 again. And I think, Ian, it was a year or two back when we had this seminar in London on different levels of integration. And you need to realize with 28 member states, the rationale for joining the European Union is a very, very different one. And the rationale for joining the euro was a very, very different one. We have increased heterogeneity. Even in this presumably very homogeneous group of 19 member states of the euro, we've got some who joined because it was not a huge change from pegging your shilling, guilder, Belgian franc to the Deutschmark. It just got a bit cheaper to trade. You had others who had a more political motive. And you had others, like the Baltics, where first and foremost there was an external security component, which is not something you usually associate with monetary unions, but for them it was not economics, it was politics. And with 28 member states with very, very heterogeneous utility functions, we attempted to have, by and large, one single treaty, and it couldn't work. So we need to increase differentiation within the European Union in order to cater for the different teleologies of why have you joined? What do you want to get out of the European Union? And these different levels of ambition, and that is where I differ a bit from the approach outlined in Jean-Claude Juncker's paper. I think it would be dangerous if it were to be too much à la carte, that you've got certain areas of cooperation where 7 member states cooperate, others where 11 cooperate, others where 23 cooperate. It really becomes some kind of a spaghetti bowl of cooperation, and it becomes very voluntaristic, and then you say, well, hell, I don't like this one, I'll drop out of that, but I will participate in tax coordination because that suits me, upon which the Irish fall down and faint. So I think you need a different structure, that you have maybe maximum 3 kinds of level of ambition for European integration, and of course the euro as such would be probably at the center of such an architecture. And indeed, Europe and the euro it's a learning animal. When we started out with the financial crisis, which definitely didn't start in Europe, at least not on the continent, we had at that stage a joint competition policy, joint state aid policy, and national individual banking supervisors. And because of this dichotomy, there was a inbuilt tendency for politicians to very weakly recapitalize banks so that they didn't have to change their business models and fall foul of competition rules in Brussels. And there were very few enlightened politicians and very few enlightened member states who nevertheless insisted that their banks be deeply recapitalized, and those are the ones that are coming out of the crisis, out of this prolonged financial crisis, in a better manner. But being a learning animal came banking union, which is not quite completed yet, but pretty complete. And I am quite positive that we will continue along this road and integrate steadily further within the euro area. But the ultimate responsibility lies, of course, with individual member states to increase competitiveness, to increase productivity, and the like. And as economists, we grew up and we looked at production functions, and we said, you've got to do this on labor, and you've got to do this on capital, and then there's total factor productivity, and everything will be hunky-dory. Increasingly, looking at different member states, I've come to realize there is one huge difference in growth rates and in GDP per capita, and that is if you have a functioning, well-functioning state, a functioning administration, a functioning judicial system, where you have recourse to courts and get a judgment in a reasonable period of time, where hospitals and other institutions are run efficiently, and that increases very, very significantly the trust that the population has in institutions and the trust that the people have in politics. And that is where in many member states much, much more could be done. Have a functioning administration that is free from political interference and which is not used as a play ball. And for that, for me, the shining example is in many of these things, it is Sweden. And I come from a country which is quite far removed from my ideal Sweden, but one has no Austrians in it. And that is something which normal programs and which normal growth theory do not prescribe, but it is something that we need to work on, because ultimately all of the problems with legitimacy that we are facing are problems of legitimacy of institutions and establishment. There is the rage against the elites. The elites are always the others, and the elites are those I don't agree with. Everybody I don't agree with is the elite. Everybody else is fine. And I recently read an extremely good book by an American sociologist who'd been doing lots of work in Mississippi, and the title of the book was Strangers in Their Own Land. And that is exactly what we need to avoid that people feel as if they are strangers in their own land, as if determination of what becomes of them, of their destiny, on a daily and a long-term basis, is taken somewhere else. So we have to give back to them, maybe not the power to make decisions, but at least the feeling as if they are partially masters of their own destiny, which has something also to do with how domestic power is distributed between the federal and the national level and the regional level and municipalities. It has something also to do with what Brussels does with the member states and not against the member states. So I think it's more an approach to democracy and accountability as a whole, and we shouldn't get only lost in very highfalutin ideas about the grand architecture of Europe, because you can have a very fine architecture, but if the guys who are putting in the bricks and the mortar don't work, then the building will never get built or it falls apart. So I'm told by Alexis that I've talked too much, and so I will forthwith stop immediately.